Osiyo. I'm Bill Blair, and you're about to watch the seventh and the final in this series on our Blair family heritage, particularly the Cherokee branch of our family. Now, we began this series in Georgia and Tennessee, following our Cherokee family as they were driven over the infamous Trail of Tears, traveling 900 miles through 6 states to their new home in Oklahoma Indian Territory. Several of our family were a part of the over 4,000 Cherokee who sadly died along the trail, and we even had one cousin who was born on the trail. We began this trip to learn more about our Cherokee ancestors, but in our ride to remember the removal, we also learned respect for who they were and for their amazing culture, strength, and perseverance as they struggled through one of the darkest times of our history and built a new nation of their own in Oklahoma. When last we left you, we were in Steelville, Missouri, getting much closer to the end of the trail and the new Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma. So let's travel on through Missouri, across the tip of Arkansas, and to the end of the trail to see what happened to our people and have a look at the new nation that they've built.
The Taylor Detachment camped at Merrimack Springs Park in James, Missouri. Now, it's a beautiful pastoral setting now, but it's more noted for being the site of the Massey Iron Works, which was the first successful iron works west of the Mississippi River. The works operated from 1826 until 1876, and it was during this period that the Cherokee on the northern route passed through. 38 miles further down the road in Waynesville, Missouri, is Laughlin Park and Robideau Creek. On December the 9th, 1837, Reverend Buttrick wrote in his diary, "We traveled about 12 miles to a settlement on the banks of a beautiful stream named Robideau. Here we had a delightful place on the bank of a river, convenient to wood and water." Now, 7 or 8 detachments of about 1,000 people each, including the Taylor Detachment, went through Springfield, Missouri. Portions of the trail can still be seen throughout the area, but Springfield is such a large urban area that as we walked some parts of the preserved trail, we felt as though we were walking through people's backyard. And in fact, if it hadn't been for the hedgerow beside us, we could have actually walked up onto their patios. Isn't much left to see across a small section of northeast Arkansas the detachments passed through. The Taylor Detachment passed Fitzgerald Station in Springdale on Wednesday, March the 20th, 1839. From there, they trekked onward through Fayetteville and Garfield, Arkansas, the site of Pea Ridge Battlefield. Pea Ridge is primarily a Civil War site, but within the battlefield park is Elkhorn Tavern. The tavern was built around 1833 and became a regular supply depot on the northern route of the Trail of Tears. From here, the detachments were only about 30 miles from Indian Territory to the west. Richard Taylor's contingent with Reverend Buttrick entered Westfield, Oklahoma, arriving in Indian Territory on March the 30th, 1839. Buttrick reported at that time, "After an early breakfast, we proceeded to Mr. Woodall's, 8 miles. This is the place of deposit and also the place where Mr. Taylor is to deliver the detachment over to the United States officers who are to supply them with provisions for a year. We arrived about noon." As detachments arrived in Indian Territory after their trek from their Appalachian homelands, they ended their journey at an assigned location in the territory chosen for their group. Now, George Woodall's farm was one of 5 terminal locations and ration issuing depots established by the U.S. government, and the one that was chosen to process the Taylor Detachment. Another and the most prominent dispersal and distribution sites was Mrs. Weber's plantation in Stillwell. The plantation grounds now house a large cemetery, which is the resting place of many prominent Cherokee and detachment leaders and guides such as Colonel Walter Adair, who was Richard Taylor's second in command, and Colonel Adair's wife. Fort Gibson in Salisaw, near where George Blair made a new home for he and his family, is the other most significant dispersal site. Fort Gibson is very well preserved with a blockhouse, parade ground, officer and enlisted men's living quarters, barracks, the magazine, and a bakery and hospital building. The fort's now a National Historic Site open to the public and the site of the Cherokee National Cemetery. The arrival and dispersal sites were very busy places as thousands of Cherokee arrived in late 1838 and early 1839. After arrival, the Cherokee would scatter throughout the territory to select home sites, but could return to these locations the next year for food and supplies, as promised in the 1835 Removal Treaty. Later, however, adding to the strain on U.S. history, when a financial settlement was finally made, the government deducted over $1.2 million for costs related to the forced removal from the $5 million which was to be paid to Cherokee for their lands that had been confiscated in Georgia. A few miles past the Woodall Farm in Westville is a Baptist mission church established by Jesse Bushyhead, another Cherokee detachment leader. Bushyhead had been the pastor of the Baptist church in Cherokee, North Carolina, and founded this church when his detachment arrived in Indian Territory. The small white mission church is now designated as a historic building and is still used today. Bushyhead, his wife, and others of his family are buried just across the highway from the little church in the Baptist Mission Cemetery. Now, it's interesting that a granite marker also stands in the little cemetery honoring Robert Rogers, the grandfather of famed performer, writer, and wit Will Rogers. Robert Rogers was a signer of the Treaty of New Echota, and he relocated to Oklahoma Indian Territory in 1837 with his wife, Sally Vann. He built a home about a mile from the Baptist Mission. Rogers was assassinated in 1842 by his fellow tribesmen seeking revenge for his joining with Major Ridge and those others who signed away the rights to Cherokee ancestral lands, forcing their removal west by the U.S. government. Rogers is buried at his home site. We spent a fair amount of time in Oklahoma searching for cemeteries and grave sites of our relatives and those whose names and lives had become familiar to us. Now, many we couldn't find, but others we were lucky enough to relocate or stumble upon. John Ross was principal chief of the Cherokee for 38 years, from 1828 to 1866, serving as chief longer than any other person. Ross led the nation through removal and relocation along the Trail of Tears and rebuilding the nation in Oklahoma. Lewis Ross, who was John's brother, was an emissary of the Cherokee to the U.S. Congress, protesting their removal and confiscation of the lands in the East. Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot and Stan Waddy were all signers of the 1835 Treaty of New Echota, ceding ancestral lands in the East to the U.S. John Ridge was Major's son. Elias was Major's nephew. Boudinot had been the editor and publisher of the first Cherokee language newspaper, The Phoenix. But all three were assassinated in June 1839 by other members of their tribe for treason in signing that 1835 treaty. Stan Waddy escaped the assassination, though, and went on to become brigadier general for the Confederacy during the war between the states. Waddy was born in Rome, Georgia in 1806 and died in Oklahoma Indian Territory in 1871. Richard Taylor, who was the Cherokee founder of Ringgold, Georgia, and the leader or conductor of the detachment that our Cherokee family were relocated with, as well as his wife Susan, are buried in the Tahlequah City Cemetery. Colonel Walter Adair, Taylor's second in command of the detachment, and his wife are buried in the cemetery at Mrs. Weber's plantation, the disbursement site in Stillwell, Oklahoma. Reverend Daniel Buttrick, who accompanied the Taylor detachment on the 900-mile trek and wrote the only complete journal account of the trail, and his wife Elizabeth are buried in the Fort Gibson National Cemetery. And as we searched for cemeteries, we were able to witness the resilience and resourcefulness of our relatives and the Cherokee people in the impressive and beautiful new nation that they've built in Oklahoma. After the 12,000 plus people exited the Trail of Tears in Oklahoma, they set about establishing a new government, adopted a new constitution, built homes and communities, and facilities to provide services including education, health and human services, employment, housing, economic and infrastructure development, environmental protection, and more. Today, all signage in the nation is printed in both English and Cherokee. The tribe has its own auto license plates, television and film networks, modern, fully equipped medical facilities, immersion schools to ensure preservation of the Cherokee language, and a program called Cherokee National Treasures, a distinction created by the nation in 1988 to recognize citizens who have made significant contributions to the preservation of the tribe's art, language, and culture. Currently, there are 94 persons in the nation who hold the designation as a national treasure. Business thrives within the nation as well. A huge tribal holding company, Cherokee Nation Businesses, employs over 7,500 Cherokee in 50 states, 26 foreign countries, and 2 U.S. territories. Revenues topped $1.1 billion in 2019, with employees working in 36 companies spanning disciplines including hospitality, federal and international consulting and contracting solutions, and community development, economic impact, and cultural preservation. There are now over 400,000 Cherokee living in the U.S., the majority of whom live in the Cherokee Nation, consisting of 14 counties of northeast Oklahoma. The capital of the nation is in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. Cherokee hold dual citizenship in the U.S. and the Cherokee Nation, and in the past fiscal year, the tribe had more than a $2.5 billion impact on the Oklahoma economy. Now, we don't know exactly where George Blair and his sisters and their families settled immediately after arriving in Indian Territory, but we do know that history books name family members as being among the first settlers of communities including Aikens, Badger Lee, Bellefonte, Miller Ridge, Northview, many more in the Oklahoma Territory. In the 1840s, George is actually reported to have owned a grocery store and been the postmaster of Winchester Community, which was later renamed Aikens. And just as an interesting side, I found that Charles Pretty Boy Floyd was from Aikens, Oklahoma, and is buried in the Aikens Cemetery. Floyd, as you might remember, was the notorious bank robber and, after John Dillinger, public enemy number 1, until he was chased down by the FBI and killed in an Ohio cornfield in October 1934. In 1855, George and Nancy Blair finally settled in Salisaw, Sequoyah County, Cherokee Nation. The famous Cherokee Sequoyah, who developed the Cherokee syllabary, moved to the territory from the Eastern Nation in 1829, which was prior to the removal in the Trail of Tears. He and his wife settled here, and Sequoyah cut logs and built a one-room cabin for his family. After his death, Sequoyah's widow sold the cabin, an additional complete set of logs Sequoyah had hewn, and 20 acres to George Blair for $20. George added to the stone fireplace on one side and used the logs to build another room on the north side of the fireplace to give he and Nancy a 2-room cabin in which to raise their family. The spinning wheel that Sequoia's wife and Nancy Blair both used is still among the furnishings of the cabin. George lived to be 98 years old. After his death in 1888, Thomas Blair, George's son, bought the house from his mother Nancy. Thomas deeded the house to his daughter, Pearl, at his death in 1931. And in 1936, Pearl and her son, Tom Blair Matheson, gave the cabin and 10 acres to the Oklahoma Historical Society for a memorial park to Sequoia. The Historical Society removed the addition George Blair had built onto the cabin and used the logs to build the Visitor Center, which still exists and is used today. Pearl was then appointed as the original custodian of the property for the Historical Society. And shortly afterward, a stone building was constructed by the WPA as a protective covering over the whole wooden cabin. Last year, in 2021, the Cherokee Nation determined that the Historical Society was not running and maintaining the memorial park to their high standards, so the nation purchased the park, as they've done recently with several other Cherokee national landmarks. And finally, we arrive at the final destination, or at least the final destination for a number of our Cherokee family ancestors. This is the Blair Cemetery, located adjacent to Sequoia Memorial Park and the Sequoia Blair Cabin. There are 59 of our ancestors who are buried in this cemetery, ranging from George Odequanosi Blair, 1789-1887, and his second wife, Nancy Blythe Blair, 1806-1892, to the most recent burial, that being George and Nancy's great-granddaughter, Cherokee Sandra Blair Beatty, 1933 to 2017. Cherokee was well known and a very popular resident. She owned and operated a landmark in the area for many years called Cherokee Landing Restaurant, and everyone from miles around enjoyed the great food and friendly hospitality that she dished out. George had 13 children with his 2 wives, Sarah Blythe Blair and Nancy Blythe Blair. Catherine, or Katie, Blair, 1837 to 1905, his daughter by Sarah, his first wife, who died somewhere around Cape Girardeau, Missouri on the Trail of Tears, married Jesse McEwen. Now, neither she nor her husband are buried in the Blair Cemetery, but their son George and his wife, Ackee Jane Walking Stick McEwen, and several of their grandchildren rest there. Likewise, George's daughter, Betty Blair Sutton, is not buried there, but her husband and 6 of her children are. One of George's children who is buried there is Thomas Blair, 1844 to 1932. Thomas, as related earlier, bought the Sequoia cabin upon his father's death and passed it down to his daughter Pearl, who donated it to the state and became its first conservator. Now, Thomas was also a prominent citizen of the Cherokee Nation in his own right. At the age of 19 in 1863, he enlisted in the 3rd Regiment of the Union Army's Indian Home Guards, mustering in at Fort Gibson and becoming a scout and Army guide. In 1866, he met and married Margaret Sanders. He built another log dwelling for them north of the Sequoia cabin, where his farming and ranching operation grew to over 1,000 acres and where he owned and built a large cotton gin. And Thomas served the public as well, being elected and serving as sheriff of Sequoia County twice, and also serving 4 years in the lower house of the Cherokee Nation legislature. At the time of his death, Thomas was a member of the nation's Cherokee Council.
You know, I could go on about the many relatives and ancestors that I've researched and come to know and respect in our Cherokee family, but I think I'll stop right here. There's an old Cherokee proverb that says, "We will be known forever by the tracks that we leave." Now, I'm really thankful that I've been able to follow these family tracks over the trail where they cried from New Echota in Georgia and Tennessee all the way to the new Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma, and to bring you along. And I'm particularly proud to have been able to see the deep tracks that our Cherokee Blair family has left in helping to develop a new home and a new nation for the Cherokee people. I hope you've enjoyed the trip. So, since there is no word for goodbye in the Cherokee language, I'll just say, Donadago Wai. Until we meet again, Wado.